The jet leg to fly over to Asia didn't seem to hit Donald Trump, who blasted Canada at 4:30 a.m. local time, promising a new 10% tariff that, in his words,
President Trump says he's imposing an additional 10% tariff on Canada in the wake of a row over a television ad.
US President Donald Trump has doubled down in his feud with Canada over a television ad that used audio of former President Ronald Reagan denouncing tariffs, saying he would punish the country with an additional 10% tariff on its goods.
Something strange just happened, and it's bigger than anyone first realized. What began as a simple TV commercial has spiraled into a trade showdown reshaping North America's economy. And it's putting the entire US-Canada relationship to the test. During a World Series broadcast, millions of Americans watching their favorite teams were suddenly shown a 1-minute ad from Ontario Premier Doug Ford. It wasn't flashy. It didn't sell a product. Instead, it featured the voice of Ronald Reagan, warning against the dangers of protectionism. For a moment, it seemed like a nostalgic nod to history. But in Washington, it landed like a political grenade. Within 24 hours, President Donald Trump fired back, announcing a brand new 10% tariff on all Canadian imports. He called the ad a provocation, accused Canada of meddling in US policy, and immediately froze all ongoing trade discussions. At first, it looked like just another flare-up between allies. But this was different. This time, there were real numbers attached, and real consequences. Trump's 10% tariff stacked on top of the existing 35% duties already imposed on non-USMCA goods, plus the added taxes on steel, aluminum, lumber, and auto parts. For North America's interconnected industries, this wasn't just a policy change. It was a potential breaking point. Because the US, Canada, and Mexico don't just trade with each other, they build together. Cars, planes, and machinery are made across borders in a single ecosystem. One part made in Windsor crosses into Detroit, then back again before it's finished. Add new tariffs at each crossing, and the costs multiply. Fast. That extra 10% could be the difference between profit and collapse. And the fact that all of this began with a 60-second ad only made it more surreal. So the question quickly became, how far will this go? And who will blink first? The White House doubled down, insisting the new tariffs were necessary to protect American jobs. Trump declared that Canada was unfairly benefiting from U.S. markets and had lied about Reagan's stance on tariffs. He went as far as saying, Reagan believed in tariffs when needed, and we need them now. Doug Ford's response? Calm, but defiant. He said, if the president heard our ad, good, because it's real. It came from one of the greatest leaders of our time, and the message still matters. But beneath the rhetoric, industry leaders across both countries were already sounding the alarm. This wasn't a theoretical debate anymore. This was a chain reaction, one that threatened to tear apart a manufacturing system decades in the making. For automakers, the math turned grim overnight. The North American auto supply chain, one of the most tightly integrated on Earth, was suddenly under siege. Steel and aluminum prices were already inflated from earlier tariff rounds. Now, Trump's 10% tariff was the final straw. Companies like GM, Stellantis, and Ford Canada began quietly cutting costs. Over time, shifts were canceled, night shifts were reduced, some facilities froze hiring altogether. For smaller suppliers, the unsung backbone of the industry, the situation was dire. These are the firms that make the essential parts, the brake systems, the wiring harnesses, the suspension components that go into every vehicle. They don't have the cash reserves of a global automaker. They can't just absorb 10% cost increases overnight. And they certainly can't pack up and move their production elsewhere. Across Ontario's manufacturing corridor, from Windsor to Oshawa, the anxiety was spreading faster than the tariffs themselves. The first major casualty came quickly. General Motors announced it would cut a full shift at its Oshawa plant, citing a changing trade environment. The move affected roughly 700 workers, with ripple effects across the region. Ottawa didn't stay quiet. In a striking counterpunch, the Canadian government slashed GM's duty-free import quota by over 24% and cut Stellantis' allocation by half, arguing that both companies had failed to meet domestic production promises. The message was unmistakable. If you move jobs out of Canada, don't expect the same access coming back in. It was a sharp reminder that Canada too could play hardball. But the ripple effects didn't stop there. Each car part, each bolt, and each circuit that crossed the border now came with extra paperwork, new taxes, and longer delays. Analysts estimated that logistics costs had risen by up to 18%, eating into already thin profit margins. Factories that once depended on seamless coordination were now drowning in bureaucracy. And industry experts began warning that if things didn't improve within a week, the entire system could seize up, halting production lines across both countries. American manufacturers now faced a cruel dilemma: absorb the costs and risk losses, or pass them on to consumers and watch demand collapse. Either way, the result was the same: a once integrated North American market now fracturing at its core. Then came the Canadian response, and it was smarter than anyone expected. Instead of retaliation, Canada turned inward. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ottawa launched the Buy Canadian initiative, a sweeping national policy directing public contracts to domestic suppliers first. It wasn't just a slogan or a patriotic gesture. It was an economic survival plan. Federal and provincial procurement would now prioritize Canadian-made steel, cars, and machinery. Local governments joined in. Dealerships launched ad campaigns under a new slogan: Canadian cars for Canadian drivers. The idea was simple, but powerful. If the U.S. wanted to wall off its markets, Canada would build its own demand from within. To ease the blow from tariffs, Ottawa introduced tax credits for automakers that kept production local. Companies that reinvested in Canadian facilities were rewarded. Those that shifted operations abroad were penalized. The message was clear: protect the jobs, protect the factories, protect the independence. Carney called it a shift from dependency to resilience, a new economic mindset built not on retaliation, but on unity. And it worked, at least at first. The Buy Canadian campaign spread across social media like wildfire. Billboards appeared in Toronto, Windsor, and Montreal, urging consumers to keep Canada working. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had never paid much attention to trade policy, began to realize their purchasing power was political power. Sales of Canadian-assembled vehicles jumped 22% in just weeks. Local automakers were suddenly national symbols. And for the first time in years, economic nationalism didn't look like a political talking point. It looked like a movement. Across Ontario and Quebec, customers started asking dealerships where their vehicles were built. If it wasn't made in Canada, many simply walked away. What began as a government initiative had turned into a public statement, a kind of quiet rebellion. Not through protests or boycotts, but through the choices made in checkout lines and car lots. But while the patriotic wave grew, the broader reality remained grim. The North American supply chain, the machine that kept all three economies moving, was breaking down. For decades, it had been one of the world's most efficient systems: steel from Canada, chips from the U.S., batteries from Mexico. Each piece moving across borders multiple times before final assembly. Now, that seamless motion was grinding to a halt. Every crossing meant a new tariff, a new inspection, a new delay. Linamar's CEO, Linda Hasenfratz, warned that, without free trade, assembly lines will stop in less than a week. And she was right. Data showed steel prices up 10%, aluminum up 8%, and Ontario's manufacturing margins hitting their lowest levels in a decade. Even smaller provinces like Manitoba and Quebec, usually buffered by diversification, were now caught in the dragnet of rising costs and shrinking profits. The idea of continental cooperation was being replaced by something older, something more defensive: economic survivalism. Yet even in crisis, something else was taking shape, something deeply Canadian. Across the country, small manufacturers began adapting instead of folding. Some pivoted to local supply networks, cutting out U.S. intermediaries entirely. Others pooled resources to share logistics and technology. The Buy Canadian policy was evolving into something more profound, a blueprint for economic sovereignty in a globalized world. Canada wasn't retreating from globalization. It was redefining how to stand firm within it.
As Carney put it in a press conference, we're not closing our doors to the world, we're building stronger foundations under them.
Still, the risk was undeniable. Every escalation from Washington threatened to undo that progress. If tariffs climbed higher, Canada could face mass layoffs, reduced investment, and slower growth. And beyond North America, the ripple effects were global. European and Asian investors began reconsidering where to place their next EV and battery facilities. If trade tensions persisted, capital could shift overseas, redrawing the world's industrial map entirely. So now the question looms larger than ever. Can self-reliance protect a nation in a globalized economy? Or is it just the first step toward deeper division? For Canada, the answer isn't clear yet. But one thing is undeniable. This time, the country isn't waiting for Washington's permission to act. From factories to households, from premiers to consumers, Canada is proving that patriotism doesn't need slogans. It needs strategy. And in that sense, Trump's 10% tariff may have achieved something unexpected. It forced Canada to remember what economic independence actually looks like. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about trade. It's about who controls the future of North America's economy, and who refuses to be controlled. If you found this story insightful, share it with someone who still believes tariffs are harmless. And remember, economic power starts at home. Subscribe for more deep dive stories that reveal the truth behind global headlines.